The impact of inflation could be one of the biggest risks you're going to face as a retiree.
A question we've heard from clients is, why aren't prices getting lower?
Sometimes inflation doesn't seem like a big issue. If you have done a plan, make sure you confirm that.
What can our listeners do to make sure they are planning for inflation?
The hard part of wrapping our mind around what our future spendings. Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Retirement Planning Simplified. I am Joe Curry, along with my co-host, as always, Lindsay Wilson. How are you, Lindsay?
I'm well, Joe. So today we're going to talk about understanding inflation and its long-term impact on retirement. So Joe, can you help our listeners understand exactly what inflation is and why it matters when it comes to their retirement planning?
Yeah, so maybe starting with why it matters. From year to year, sometimes inflation doesn't seem like a big issue, although has been a bigger topic lately. But anyway, over time, though, the impact of inflation could be one of the biggest risks you're going to face as a retiree. So backing it up a little bit, what is inflation? So the simple explanation is inflation is the rate at which prices for goods and services rise. And in other words, it's decreasing the rate at which your purchasing power is decreasing. So for example, a coffee that costs $2 today may cost $2.10 a year from now if inflation is 5%, right? And so thinking about that decreasing purchasing power, Lindsay, what I mean there is if I just keep my $2 in the bank and I get zero interest on it, and next year I go to buy a coffee, I don't have enough money now, right? So my purchasing power is not as strong anymore.
Mm-hmm. So a question we've heard from clients is, why aren't prices getting lower? They are talking about how inflation is coming down on the news.
Yeah, so this is really common where people just naturally think, okay, inflation's coming down, so I should see prices start to come down. But just because inflation rates are decreasing, it doesn't mean that prices are actually dropping or coming down. So typically prices tend to rise over time, and even a drop in inflation only just slows the price at which prices increase. But it's important to note here that prices will keep going up if we have inflation, no matter how low that inflation is. So for example, if a loaf of bread increased by $1 over the past year, lower inflation doesn't mean the price will come back down. It just means that this year it will increase in price less than what we saw in the previous year. So maybe this year, it just increases 20 cents a loaf. So we still have inflation. We still have an increase in price, but it's just at a lower rate than what we've seen previously. So deflation is what we would need to see in order to have decreasing prices. Okay, so more specifically, deflation is an actual decrease in prices or negative inflation. Another way of putting that. Okay. So Lindsay, this could be a bit confusing. It might be a reason why some people are confused is that there's something else that's called disinflation. Okay. So, and people may have heard that word in the media when they're listening to the news that we have disinflation. And that sounds really close to deflation. But basically disinflation is a word used to describe the reduction in the rate of inflation. So in other words, when inflation is decreasing, we have deflation. But as I pointed out, deflation doesn't mean prices are going down because we still have inflation there or price increases.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk more specifically about how inflation affects retirement planning?
Sure. So it's critical to have a plan that's going to allow you to keep up with inflation over time. So we often have people tell us that they don't believe the future cash flow projections in a plan when they see those inflated numbers, those numbers that are increasing with inflation over time. Mm. And to be honest, Lindsay, this is a reason why with a lot of our planning, we don't actually show what we call nominal figures. We show the real numbers, which is showing the numbers in today's dollars because it makes sense. That's what we're spending. We're spending money in today's dollars. So what I mean is just to kind of give you an example of how impactful though inflation can be. If you're spending $100,000 today, let's say age 55, and plan to have similar expenses at age 85, at 3% inflation, you would need almost $250,000 to match your spending today that's only costing you $100,000. So that's what I'm saying. When people look at it, if they see that future number, they're spending $100,000 today, they say, there is no way ever in my lifetime am I going to spend $250,000 a year. It's just not going to happen, right? But that's not spending more money than they're spending today. It's buying the same amount of goods and services and utilities. That's no change. That's just what inflation does to our spending. So just to keep up with what we're doing today, that's what we need to spend in that scenario. Now, to make matters worse, spikes in late life spending are typically caused by healthcare issues. And historically, healthcare expenses have increased faster than general inflation. So it's something else to keep in mind. So this is, again, why it's important to know that inflation does affect your retirement planning.
Mm-hmm. So how can our listeners mitigate the effects of inflation in retirement?
Sure. So maybe I'll give another example of something I hear clients say once in a while, or potential clients when we're meeting with them. They say some version of, Joe, look, I need $50,000 of income from my investments. I have $1 million and I'm probably not going to live beyond 20 years. So all I really need to do right now is put my money in the bank and my retirement is guaranteed, right? So just to help with where I'm going with that, if you have $1 million, if you spend $50,000 a year, you have 20 years of spending if nothing changes in the value of that money, right? So for some people that feels safe. It feels like I don't need to take any kind of risk, or maybe I take some minimal like high interest savings or GIC risk, but that interest is not going to help people keep up with inflation. And that's, again, the hard part of wrapping our mind around what our future spending is going to look like. So this inflation piece is often very, very underestimated. So to mitigate these risks and get back to your question, Lindsay, it's important to primarily invest in asset classes that have historically outpaced inflation. So we've talked about having, a bucket of globally diversified companies. And as we've discussed in the past, we like the idea of buckets. So if we're thinking about our buckets, we understand that we need to have our short-term we need to have short-term investments that are going to give us some certainty around having that income when we need it, right? So that's our short-term or our defense bucket, but we still have to have that other bucket for our longer-term growth, which can cover that inflation-adjusted spending that we're going to need into the future, right? So the other thing we know is that inflation sequence of return, so when and how inflation shows up, because it's not going to be 3% every single year, as we've seen lately. We had really low inflation, spiked up to the highest inflation we've seen in decades, and we're coming back down to a more normal pace again. So when and how inflation shows up is a risk, and that's not a risk that is built into retirement planning softwares as a way to mitigate, right? So it's also important to have a plan in place for how when you need to adapt in order to stay on track long term for your retirement.
So in conclusion, Joe, I think we understand that inflation is real and we need to account for it. What can our listeners do to make sure they are planning for inflation?
Sure. So the first thing is, if you have done a plan, whether on your own or you've worked with a financial planner, make sure you confirm that inflation is built into the plan in the first place. That's kind of number one, right? And then number two is, if you haven't done any planning, you need to start the process. And so as we've talked about in the past, the game kind of changes when we get to retirement. Because of all these sequence of return risk, sequence of inflation risk. Those are just two things that come up in retirement that aren't really an issue as we're planning to get to retirement. So if you haven't done the planning, reach out to someone who is skilled in this area to help ensure that you have a plan that's built to handle inflation and all these other retirement risks.
Any final thoughts?
I think that's it for today, Lindsay.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.